Hey guys, Naz here. Today I'm going to be taking you through my experience of ordering Spoonflower Minky for the first time. First I'll show you how I came up with my design, I'll show you what it looks like printed, and then I'll show you a sewn example, and I'll go over the pros and cons that I've found going through this process. So I was ordering the fabric for both Princess Cadence and Princess Celestia because there was no way that I was going to have time before this convention to custom dye all the gradients in their hair. I also found that the last time that I did do that, I didn't exactly match the colours perfectly because the equivalent minky and dye to exactly match their colours doesn't really exist. Their colours are a little bit too saturated than what you can actually achieve with that process. But I still really wanted the gradient and I didn't want to have to sew all these curves, so I thought that now was the time to try Spoonflower Minky, custom printed Minky. So I started off by ordering one of these printed in Minky while Spoonflower was having a sale. And this is their hex colour map. So it's the size of a full yard of Minky. It's quite large in person, and I would definitely recommend that this is almost mandatory to buy before you start ordering projects, prints from Spoonflower. I found that if I did not have this, I would have had to order several times over. I already messed up by thinking I could guess a couple of colours, and I had to reorder a second time for Celestia, as we'll talk about in a minute. So anyway, you can order this colour map printed on Minky. You'll find that when you do print with Spoonflower Minky, the colours are a lot more saturated in the print than what your design looks like on your screen. They can also vary in hue a little bit. I got some advice on lowering saturation and such when ordering, but even then, tweaking by eye, I still had an error that resulted in me having to reorder. So if you zoom in, you can see every little block has a hex code on it, if my computer will zoom in. Yeah, each little block has a little hex code on it in RGB colour. All your files are in RGB, which is much easier to work with because that's just standard. And once you have this in front of you in person, the text is very easy to read, surprisingly, on the Minky. So I had no issue looking up each colour and going, okay, this is the closest pink to the colour of Cadence's mane that I want. What's the hex code? Input that into Photoshop into my file, and I found that that was the only way that I could get my colours to match perfectly for my desired prints. So this thing is just a beast in person, and I think it'll only cost you maybe $25 or so to get this printed out, so I would definitely recommend it if you're going to be using Spoonflower for more than just a single project sort of thing. So I'll take you back into the file that I created. I'll just go over how I came out with the sizing. I'm going to preface this with saying that I did have some errors in my sizing. I'm not really sure where I went wrong, so if you can figure out where I went wrong, send me a private message. So I made my file 137 centimetres wide, or 54 inches, which is what they describe on the Minky printing page, and I made it a yard long. So that would be 1 yard of printable Minky. I had a little bit of stretch sort of in my proportions. I don't know where I went wrong. I could have accidentally warped something when I was editing the files, not quite sure. But once I had the, this is just the second reprint that I got after I ordered the first, and it's just a smaller file, so it'll be easier for me to show you guys how I came up with all of this. So after I patterned Celestia's mane and tail, I came into Photoshop and I overlaid shapes on top of that and applied gradient masks, gradient overlays on top of those colours. So we'll go through and we'll break down, let's see, So you should be able to see each of the colour blocks that I've put in over the top of the designs, the pattern. So if I go through here and I reduce the opacity, you can see the pattern for the main underneath, and all I did was get the pen tool, select shape, select the colour, the base colour that I wanted, and I went and traced all around to get those colours in place. The reason I did this is because you can infinitely scale your shapes created in Photoshop as a vector. So if I wanted to rotate or enlarge or shrink, I wouldn't have any problems with losing image quality as I transferred and changed things up. So you can just see the outlines of the shapes there. And originally I would put these all into a folder, and I just I put a lock onto the folder so that, say, I was drawing on top of this main, so that it would only draw on the main, not on anything else. And I thought that I could just get a big white brush at a low opacity with soft feathering around the edges, and just draw white underneath to get the gradients that way. But I found that didn't give me very much control over the angle, the sort of width, the feathering, etc. on the gradients. So after ditching that idea, I went and individually applied gradients onto every single colour. It wasn't really that hard, because once I had it done for blue, green, dusty blue and pink, I just copied those gradients and tweaked them depending on the angles that were needed. So I'll show you what I've done here. So this is just the top piece of one of her main pieces. So I've just gone in, you click the shape and then go effects, gradient overlay, and then that will bring up this page. And I went in, and here I have my gradient, and you can double click on here to colour pick what colour you're after, and I would just input the hex codes that I found on that colour chart, and then adjust the you can adjust the opacity, the angle of the gradient, how extreme or feathered the gradient should be. If anything, if you're trying to go for gradients, I would probably try and make them a bit harsher than you would think they need to be, because I found that on the minky, on these big broad pieces of minky, you might not notice the gradient as much if it's not very extreme, but that's just my personal opinion. So when I was ordering this, originally I ordered the fabric for Cadence and Celestia. Cadence's fabric came out fine, and so did Celestia's, except the only thing was I'd colour picked the green from her hair without double checking it on the hex swatches, and it turned out sort of like a bright lime green, which I really didn't like, because Celestia sort of has this more subdued green, and it really clashed and was just really blaring, and unfortunately I had to order it again. Luckily I had the time to. I also ordered these secondary sort of 3D elements for Cadence's wings, but the second lot of fabric that I got after I double checked with those hex codes was perfect with all the colours. If you have any questions about what colours I used for either Cadence's or Celestia's hair, feel free to message me and I'll get you the hex codes that I used, and after you see the final product you'll be able to see what the result was using those hex codes. So after I populated this, trying as best as I can to squish everything in, keeping in mind that the nap of the minky goes down like it would on a normal piece of minky. I tried to get everything roughly with the nap going the right way. I did have to curve this tail piece around a bit to fit it in, but considering the price, I sort of didn't want to order a second yard, so it was worth it for me to have the nap just going slightly off. I didn't think it would make too big a difference. I pretty much filled in as much as I possibly could, and I thought originally on my first order I did the background all in this turquoise, which is one of the colours that I use in Tia's Main, but for the second order I just thought let's go crazy and put in a psychedelic rainbow, and I just have kept all these pieces after I've cut out the mane, tail and wing pieces, just so that if I ever need a very small piece with a certain gradient on it, perhaps I can use that. But you might want to print a galaxy pattern on your background, or just a colour that you feel like you might use in the future. You may as well use up all these little scrap pieces, because even they can be reasonably large, but that's just what I chose to do. So enough hurting your eyes with that. So now what I did was upload this file onto the Spoonflower website. So after I save my file out as a PNG in RGB, I go ahead and upload it on the Spoonflower website. You just need to make up an account so that you can upload your own files. And you're going to change the DPI either smaller or bigger. I needed to enlarge it so that it is 300 DPI, so that it's accounting for the DPI that my file was saved at. So I've gone ahead and chosen Minky, which is 27 Australian dollars a yard. And then I've made sure that 1 yard is selected. It'll initially come out as a swatch or a fat quarter, which you don't want unless you're ordering a sample. So make sure that that's selected, and make sure that it is centered, which is what I did, how I printed mine. So essentially now you have your file shown to scale. You can view the original, you can preview. On my initial print I did up a little grid of inch squares and made sure that they lined up with all the little lines on here. And then you're pretty much ready to go, so you can add that to your cart and order it. I ordered mine with their rush service, which you pay a bit more for postage, but it's printed and shipped the next day, which I had to do because I'm on a bit of a crunch to get these ponies done for this convention. So they were very fast and prompt with sending that out if you pay for the rush service. It does take a fair bit longer if you don't pay for that, but it depends on how quickly you need the fabric. From my experience, I would definitely recommend scaling everything down and ordering something like a swatch or a fat quarter with your colours before you get them printed at a large scale. I probably should have done that, but I was thinking that I could be sneaky and just get things done as soon as possible, but it actually put me back as far as time goes because I had to reorder Celestia's fabric. But yeah, that's pretty much how you go about ordering it. Looking at this now, I think I might realise why my scale was off. I put centre, I probably should have put basic. It looks like there's a slight scale difference between the two. Centre might stretch it out to fit, whereas basic might just plonk it right there in the middle. Centre looks smaller than basic, which is the problem that I had. So that might be where I went wrong. If I order Minky again in the future, I'll let you guys know if that fixes my problem. It wasn't a massive scale issue, there was just a tiny bit of difference. I had to scale down my pattern a tiny bit to get it to fit. But anyway, now that you've got all that ordered, I'm going to show you what it looks like printed. So here's my very first order that I placed when it arrived. This was 2 yards of the custom printed Minky. It arrived quite wrinkled, but I guess it was coming all the way to Australia. I'm not sure if it arrives this wrinkled when it's just going to the States. Here you see my little inch and centimetre scale that I placed up the top. Those measured perfectly fine against my ruler. But you can see that the Minky itself has this texture that's sort of, or a grain to the print that doesn't really go away, because you can always sort of see a little bit of texture of the white Minky underneath. You can see that it's not terrible, but it's definitely noticeable. I would sort of be picky with what I use it on in the future. It's definitely worse on the darker colours, so I found that Celestia's prints worked out much better than Cadence's because Cadence has some very dark pink and purple. But it did save me a lot of time with all those gradients, and I think it's definitely worth it for the money. Here I was just testing out some gradients for a future commission. I'm not sure if I'm going to go ahead because it's just so easy to see the white minky as soon as it's loosely ruffled, and it just has that general texture to it that even if you brush it perfectly you can't really get rid of. But that's not to say that it's terrible. It might not even bother you, but you can sort of notice it a tiny bit. Here's the second order that I put through, and you can probably notice that the green is definitely less saturated. It's more of a blue tinted, less saturated green. So I was really happy with the colours on this second order. So I'll take you through how I went about sewing the tail and how I went about finishing that tail. So I had my seam allowance done up in the colours of what was inside the seam, just in case I needed some wriggle room as far as stretching or I didn't want to sort of abruptly end into a different colour exactly where the seam is, so that when I'm sewing, if I don't sew exactly on the seam, I'm going to get that other colour showing through. So one thing I found is that because this minky is a shorter pile than normal Shannon minky, I found it a bit more silky and a tiny bit slipperier than normal minky. A little bit harder to pin in my opinion. So I used an absolute ton of pins just because I didn't want to be messing around with such a large piece. I didn't want to accidentally have anything mess up. So I'm just going through here at 8 times speed and sewing all those curves very carefully. I personally sew over my pins, but it's a risk that I take on myself, so if you want to do that, do so at your own risk. But I find that with the small glass head pins I very rarely get a pin breaking. Occasionally I do, but I haven't really had a terrible incident with it yet. And it's just much easier and more exact to sew over the pins, especially when you're dealing with these really wiggly curves that are a real pain to sew. I actually sewed this whole tail twice. I didn't bother to film the second time because it's the exact same thing. I just really wanted to make sure those seams were really strong. Here I'm removing all the pins, and what I'm going to do is turn this inside out and just make sure that I haven't made any mistakes. I did have to sew over a couple of curves that I'd missed on the opposite side, and that was just an issue of not having enough seam allowance because of those slight warping issues that I mentioned earlier. So I just picked a little place to fold the tail out, just examined all the seams on the outside to make sure there wasn't any puckers. I found that this fabric, unless you pin it very, very heavily, it does like to pucker a little bit. So especially when I was sewing Cadence and I wasn't aware of its tendency to do this, I did get a couple of puckers on her mane that I had to re-sew. It wasn't really a big deal, but just something I'd keep in mind. It's easier just to pin it really heavily once than have to redo it again a second time. So I cut away all my seam allowance like I do on all my plushies. Just it's easier than manually cutting and clipping and etc. It's just easier to get rid of all of it. And here you have the tail stuffed. So pretty much the same as you would do for any normal plush. I didn't really notice a great change in shape because of stretch, but again I was only using this for manes and tails. Here you can see that sort of loose grain texture. I guess you could call it more of a texture in the print. It's not unpleasant to touch or anything, but you can sort of see that it has this permanent flecking of white through it. Definitely is less noticeable on paler colours like this, and I was actually really happy with how that came out. But here I'm going to fix up all those whites showing on the seams, and that actually wasn't very hard to do. I just got my cat hair slicker brush and I just went and thoroughly brushed all those seams. This was another reason that I double sewed the tail, because I knew I was going to be quite aggressively brushing at those seams to cover up those white areas. So just double stitching that, make sure that I'm not accidentally going to tear through any of those stitches. And I'm just going through and I'm going to brush out all that white as best I can. On Cadence, just brushing her tail and mane out wasn't enough because her colours were much darker, especially the dark purple, and even though I brushed it as best I could, there were still white areas showing. So what I ended up doing on Cadence was mixing up a batch of paint, airbrush paint that matched the colour. So in her case it was dark purple, and after brushing out all the seams I just went in and carefully airbrushed purple on top of those white areas that weren't very pleasant to look at. I found that with Cadence, sometimes because you can see that tiny little texture of the white showing through, the purple was less dark than I wanted it to be, or it was lighter than I wanted it to turn out. So I ended up having to go in and darken some of those dark gradients on her with an airbrush manually. I probably wouldn't order dark printed minky again, just because I find it a bit of a pain to have to manually clean up all those seams. Depends on what you prefer to do. I personally probably would prefer to just airbrush them in the first place to get that gradient, but it depends on, it depends on what you want to do, whether you care about a bit of white showing or not. But I was extremely happy with the results for Celestia here. So that's pretty much my experience with printed Spoonflower Minky. I thought it looked particularly good for Celestia because she has those pale pastel colours and the white isn't very noticeable. Here you can see I'm going through, this is actually just a clean bristle brush that I use for brushing down the Minky nap when I'm taking photographs of plushies. It's easier than going in with your hand and manually brushing all those little tufts of Minky downwards. But I found that if the Minky is roughed up a bit with the Spoonflower Minky, that grained look will be a bit more obvious. So whenever I'm finished doing something with it, I'm usually just getting this little brush and just brushing all the nap downwards so it's not roughed up in any areas, and that just makes it look as good as it possibly can be. Here you can see the final result for Celestia and her tail. I haven't yet sewn her mane, but after going off how Cadence's mane went, I would say that it's much easier to get a good result if you're just using this for flat pieces that maybe just have some quilt batting in the middle. Stuffing definitely increases sort of that white showing texture underneath, but I don't think it's too bad. It's really only noticeable if you're being very picky and looking close up like this, but from a distance I think it looks really fantastic. And I got to sew Celestia's tail in maybe half an hour as opposed to many days that it would normally take to sew all those curves. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll definitely order some more Spoonflower fabric in the future, and hopefully I'll be able to work out what my scaling issue was. But I hope you guys learnt something from what I've sort of gone through and the pros and cons of using this Minky, some certain tips and hints that I've given along the way. Definitely grab one of those hex code colour maps printed out in Minky if you can, because as I mentioned earlier, the colour can greatly differ from what's on your screen. So wish me luck in finishing these ponies before this convention, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!